Somewhere around 1800 BC, the oldest civilization in the Americas went dark. Cities that had thrived for 1,000 years were abandoned. Pyramids fell silent. And then, something remarkable happened. This is history that hits. Today, the story of Peñico, a 3,500-year-old city unveiled in Peru in July 2025, and what it tells us about how civilizations don't just collapse, they transform. To understand Peñico, we first need to talk about a civilization most people have never heard of, one that was building pyramids while Egypt was building pyramids. Around 3000 BC, in a narrow river valley about 200 kilometers north of modern Lima, something unprecedented was happening. People were building a city. Not a village, a city. They called it Caral. And for the next 1,000 years, this city would anchor the first complex civilization anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, centuries before the Olmec, millennia before the Maya. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. When Caral fell, the people who carried its legacy forward didn't scatter into oblivion. They climbed higher, literally, into the mountains. And in 2025, archaeologists finally found where they went. Let's start with Caral itself, because its story deserves to be far more widely known. The Caral-Supe civilization emerged around 3000 BC in Peru's Supe Valley. To put that in perspective, Mesopotamia's great cities were just hitting their stride. Egypt's old kingdom was rising along the Nile, and on the other side of the world, in total isolation, Caral was doing the same thing. No contact between them. No shared technology. No trade routes connecting the Nile to the Pacific coast of South America. This was parallel evolution of human complexity, happening independently. At its peak, around 2600 BC, Caral's sacred city covered roughly 1,500 acres. It featured 6 pyramids, sunken circular plazas, and monumental staircases, all built without writing, pottery, or the wheel. Think about that for a moment. No written language. No ceramic vessels, no wheeled carts. And yet they organized the labor, resources, and planning to raise pyramids that still stand today. Instead of writing, they used quipu, intricate systems of knotted strings that encoded information through the position, color, and type of each knot, record keeping without a single written word. Instead of pottery, they wove intricate baskets and used gourds. Instead of metal tools, they shaped stone with extraordinary precision. They solved every problem with what they had. The Caral-Supe civilization sustained itself for roughly 1,200 years. Generation after generation, building, trading, and organizing, a continuity that rivals almost any ancient culture on Earth. And then, around 1800 BC, it ended. The great cities of the Supe Valley were abandoned. The pyramids fell quiet. The plazas emptied. A millennium of continuous civilization, gone. The cause of Caral's collapse remains debated among researchers. Some point to climate change, particularly devastating El Niño events that could have wrecked the irrigation systems Caral depended on. Others emphasize internal social pressures, resource depletion, population strain, the kind of slow-motion crisis that rarely has a single cause. The truth is probably a combination of both. For decades, that collapse was where the story stopped. Caral falls, a gap appears in the archaeological record, and the next major Andean civilizations don't emerge for centuries. A black hole in the timeline. But Professor Winifred Creamer, an anthropologist who studied the region, noticed something. When the coastal cities declined, extensive irrigation canals started appearing farther north. People were moving. As Creamer put it, people were moving to more fertile ground and taking their knowledge of irrigation with them, not fleeing in panic, migrating with purpose. Climate refugees 3,800 years ago. And that brings us to July 2025 and a press conference that sent ripples through the archaeological world. On July 3, 2025, after 8 full years of excavation and research, Peruvian archaeologists officially unveiled a site called Peñico, a 3,500-year-old city hidden high in the Andes. Peñico sits in Peru's Barranca province, about 200 kilometers north of Lima, perched at 600 meters above sea level, far higher than the coastal valley cities of Caral. Based on radiocarbon dating and artifact analysis, researchers believe Peñico was founded between 1800 and 1500 BC, precisely the window when the Caral-Supe civilization was collapsing. That timing is not a coincidence. As the coastal cities emptied, this mountain settlement grew. Peñico didn't emerge from nothing. It emerged from Caral's ashes. So far, excavations have unearthed 18 distinct structures at the site, including both residential homes and ceremonial temples, evidence of a fully functioning urban center, not just a temporary refuge. Among the artifacts recovered, clay sculptures depicting humans and animals, and necklaces crafted from carved beads and seashells. Seashells, found 600 meters up in the mountains. Those seashells are a crucial detail. They tell us that Peñico wasn't isolated up in the mountains. It was connected, actively trading with communities down on the Pacific coast. In fact, researchers have given Peñico a remarkable nickname, the City of Social Integration, because its inhabitants didn't just trade with the coast. They connected three entirely different ecological zones. Peñico sat at the intersection of trade routes linking Pacific coastal communities, highland Andean settlements, and, remarkably, communities deep in the Amazon basin. Think about the geography for a moment. The Pacific coast, the Andes Mountains, the Amazon rainforest. Three radically different environments, separated by some of the most extreme terrain on Earth. And 3,500 years ago, Peñico was linking them together. Seashells traveling up from the coast, jungle products moving through mountain passes, highland goods heading in both directions. This challenges a long-held assumption in archaeology. The idea that pre-Columbian societies in the Americas developed in relative isolation from one another, separated by geography and limited technology. Peñico suggests the opposite. Even after the collapse of their parent civilization, these communities maintained, and possibly expanded, long-distance networks of exchange and cooperation. It's a pattern historians sometimes call the successor state phenomenon. When a civilization collapses, the knowledge doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it migrates, adapts, and finds new expression somewhere else. We see it after the fall of Rome, when Byzantine and Islamic civilizations preserved and transformed Roman knowledge. We see it after the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean. And now, it seems, we're seeing it in the Americas. 3,500 years ago, Caral fell. Peñico rose. The thread of civilization didn't snap. It was rewoven. Now, it's important to acknowledge what we don't know. The relationship between Peñico and Caral is inferred through timing, proximity, and shared cultural traits, but not yet definitively proven through continuous material evidence. Some archaeologists prefer the broader term Norte Chico civilization over Caral-Supe, and debate whether these sites represent a single unified culture or a network of related but independent communities. That distinction matters. If Caral was a true centralized state, then its collapse and Peñico's rise tell a story of political succession. If it was a looser network, the story becomes one of adaptation within a broader tradition. Either way, the implication is profound. Complex social organization in the Americas is far older and far more resilient than traditional narratives suggest. Let's talk about the woman who made much of this possible. Ruth Shady Solís, a Peruvian archaeologist, has led research on the Caral civilization for decades and fought to protect it. Shady Solís identified Caral as a major civilizational center in the late 1990s, at a time when most scholars believed complex Andean society began much later. Her work upended the conventional timeline. She also fought, sometimes at personal risk, against real estate developers and land traffickers who wanted to bulldoze the Caral archaeological zone for construction projects. Thanks largely to her advocacy, Caral was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2009, recognition that helped secure ongoing protection and funding for continued research across the region. The research that led to Peñico's discovery grew directly from that foundation, from the institutional support and scholarly attention that Shady Solís helped build over decades of persistent work. Excavation at Peñico began in 2017. For 8 years, teams worked methodically through layers of soil and time, mapping, cataloging, and carefully extracting artifacts from the earth. 8 years. In an era of instant results and viral news cycles, that kind of patience is itself remarkable. Real archaeology is measured in seasons, not headlines. The 18 structures uncovered so far include residential buildings that show evidence of daily domestic life, cooking areas, storage spaces, living quarters, alongside larger ceremonial structures. That combination is significant. It means Peñico wasn't just a temple complex or a trading post. It was a place where people lived, worshipped, cooked meals, raised families, and built community. The clay sculptures found at the site are particularly striking. Small figures depicting animals and human forms, crafted by hands that shaped them 3,500 years ago and left their fingerprints in the clay. There's something quietly staggering about holding an object that still bears the fingerprints of its maker from nearly 4 millennia ago. Time collapses in your hand. The seashell necklaces found at Peñico deserve special attention. Spondylus shells, thorny oysters native to warm Pacific waters, were among the most valued trade goods in the ancient Andes. Spondylus was sometimes called the gold of the Andes, prized for ritual use and traded over enormous distances. Finding them at Peñico confirms this city was plugged into major exchange networks. Peñico's strategic position at 600 meters elevation made it an ideal hub, high enough to access mountain resources, low enough to maintain regular contact with the coast, positioned to reach the Amazon drainage. It was, in modern terms, a crossroads, a place where different worlds met: coastal fishermen's products, highland farmers' crops, jungle communities' exotic materials, all converging at one mountain city. And this is what makes the city of social integration nickname so apt. Peñico wasn't just trading goods, it was integrating people, bringing together communities from radically different environments. This model of integration challenges the assumption that the collapse of a major civilization necessarily leads to fragmentation and decline. Sometimes collapse becomes a catalyst for wider connection. When the centralized power of Caral dissolved, it may have freed peripheral communities to form new, more horizontal networks. Not a pyramid of authority, but a web of mutual benefit. It's a counterintuitive idea, but one that resonates beyond ancient Peru. Decentralization doesn't always mean disorder. Sometimes it means innovation. Now, there's a larger context that makes Peñico's discovery especially timely. The story of Caral's collapse, driven at least partly by climate change, carries uncomfortable echoes of our own moment. Around 1800 BC, El Niño events likely intensified, disrupting the predictable weather patterns that Caral's agricultural systems depended on. When the climate shifted, the infrastructure couldn't adapt fast enough. Sound familiar? A civilization built around specific climate conditions, facing rapid environmental change, watching its systems strain under new pressures. The parallels write themselves. But here's where Peñico offers something unexpected: hope. Because the story of Caral's collapse isn't actually a story of extinction. It's a story of movement, adaptation, and reinvention. People left the coast. They moved higher. They built new networks. They didn't cling to a failing system, they created a new one. And it worked for centuries. The site is now open to the public, making it one of the few major archaeological discoveries that became immediately accessible to visitors, a decision that reflects Peru's commitment to its ancient heritage. If you're planning a trip to Peru, consider adding both Caral and Peñico to your itinerary alongside Machu Picchu. They're far older and far less crowded, and they offer a completely different window into Andean civilization. Both sites are located in the Barranca province, roughly 200 kilometers north of Lima. Accessible by road in about 4 hours. Far more reachable than many of Peru's remote archaeological zones. For those interested in the academic side, look into the work of Ruth Shady Solís. Her decades of research on the Caral civilization, and her fight to protect the sites, is a remarkable story in its own right. And if nothing else, let this story rewrite one common misconception. The Americas were not a civilizational late bloomer. Complex society here is as old as anywhere on Earth. There's a broader lesson in Peñico's story worth sitting with. We tend to tell the history of civilizations as a story of rise and fall, a clean arc from beginning to end. But Peñico suggests something messier and more truthful. Civilizations don't just end, they shed their skin. The people survive, adapt, move, reconnect. The story continues, in a different key. When we look at the challenges facing our own civilization, climate disruption, resource strain, institutional fragility, the temptation is to imagine only two outcomes: survival or collapse. Peñico whispers a third possibility: transformation. Not clinging to what was, but carrying what matters, knowledge, relationships, ingenuity, into what comes next. The people of Caral didn't save their pyramids. They saved something more important: the knowledge to build new ones. And they built them higher. 3,500-year-old city, hidden in the Andes, telling a story we needed to hear. Not about how civilizations die, but about how they are reborn. If this story changed how you think about ancient civilizations, share it with someone who still thinks history in the Americas started with Columbus. They need this one. This has been history that hits. The past is never past. It just waits for someone to pay attention.